Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another virtual event of the Basquiat Society of Washington, D.C. My name is Steve Dewey, and I'm the chapter director of our Washington, D.C. chapter. The Basquiat Society is the public outreach program of the American Institute for Economic Research, otherwise known as AIER. We promote the principles of free market economics, sound money, property rights, limited government, and a free society. If you would like to learn more about AIER and the Basquiat Society, our website address is aier.org. For our event today, I'm very excited to have Professor Richard Salsman as our featured speaker. He will be speaking on a very timely economic, political, and philosophical topics that are covered in his new book, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? In his new book, Professor Salsman discusses how American officials have radically abridged civil and economic liberties in recent years, but it is only part of an intensifying hostility towards capitalism this century. Capitalism has become a scapegoat for a range of personal grievances and societal ills. Not long ago, during the last 2 decades of the last century, the trend was toward capitalism. The U.S.S.R. had collapsed, the Cold War had ended peacefully, and freer systems like the United States and the United Kingdom were victorious. However, the so-called intellectuals denounced neo-liberalism and revived anti-capitalist dogmas and policies such as Marxism, Keynesian protectionism and nationalism, postmodernism, critical race theory, etc. So what explains this odd trend shift? Who were the pro-capitalist champions of neoliberalism? Where have they gone? If they have heirs, why have they been so quiet? Professor Salsman answers these important questions. His theme, capitalism requires a moral defense, not merely an economic one. A brief summary of Professor Salsman's background. He is an assistant professor of political economy at Duke University. He's also the founder and president of Intermarket Forecasting, a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, which sponsors our Basquiat Society. And he's also a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. In the 1980s and 1990s, Professor Salsman was a banker at the Bank of New York and Citibank, and an economist at Wainwright Economics. He authored 3 books in the past. The first one was Breaking Banks, Central Banking Problems and Free Banking Solutions in 1990, Gold and Liberty, published in 1995, and The Political Economy of Public Debt, 3 Centuries of Theory and Evidence, published in 2017. And he's just published his new book, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? So Professor Salsman has also authored dozens of chapters of books and scores of articles. His works have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, The Economist, the Financial Post, Forbes, The Hill, The Intellectual Activist, The Objective Standard, and the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy. Professor Salsman earned his BA in economics from Bowdoin College, his MA in economics from New York University, and his PhD in political economy from Duke University. Before we get started with our discussion, please note that our event is scheduled for 75 minutes until 2:15 p.m. And we will reserve plenty of time at the last part of our event for probably for at least 30 minutes for a Q&A session with attendees. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So now I will turn it over to our featured speaker, Richard Salsman. Professor Salsman, please proceed.
Thank you, Steve, very much for hosting this. I've really enjoyed our conversations in recent years about all these things. I thought I would give the audience an overview of the book and its themes. I will share a document, not too long, and then I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and comments at the end. Every time I see a book tour, I think that the best ones with the authors being interviewed, if they can explain why their book is relevant and pertinent, if they can explain why it's distinctive, why it's different from the other books on the various topics, and then hopefully it's interesting, hopefully it's provocative in some way, it makes you think about ways you hadn't thought of before. So on those three scores, let me grade myself. It's easy, I think, for this to be relevant because capitalism is really under attack in a way that I haven't seen since the 1930s, not that I was alive then. 1930s, maybe 1970s. The 1930s, very serious fascism and communism on the rise pre-World War II. But even the 70s, which began by going off the gold standard and having fiat paper money and all the regulations and all the controls and all the double-digit inflation and gas lines, everyone's remembering, who remembers that, a pretty bad period, blaming greed, blaming oil companies, blaming banks, until Thatcher and Reagan came along. So I think in terms of relevance, any discussion of capitalism today, it's on the lips not simply of pro-capitalists like myself. I'm an unabashed pro-capitalist, but the anti-capitalist, from the AOCs to Sanders to Obama to others, there are interestingly many books on capitalism with capitalism in the title. And I keep track of these, especially the more important ones. Probably 95, maybe even 99% of them are anti-capitalist. So they're using the title. Publishers do find that these books are valuable and popular if they have capitalism in the titles. That's another reason to think this is relevant. But there's very few pro-capitalist books. So that gets to my point about distinctive. Why is it distinctive? It's distinctive because it's a book on capitalism that's actually pro-capitalist. And then further, I would say, it's not just pro-capitalist on an economic level. It's very common for people, even who sympathize with capitalism, to think of it as solely an economic system. You know, the system of profit and loss, the system of incentives and competition and things like that. And it is that. It's not, that's not untrue. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that it's also a broader cultural, if you will, social system that has a very unique set of attitudes, a very unique set of premises. I'll go through some of these in a moment during the presentation, during the slides. But that is in the book, and that I think makes it very distinctive. Interestingly, it's actually the approach I take in teaching at Duke as well. At Duke, I'm in a program called PP&E, and P stands for philosophy, the second P stands for politics, the third for economics. It's an interdisciplinary approach that says, really, for all social systems, not just capitalism, unless you understand those three aspects of it, it's very difficult to get your hands around what they're really saying. So I'll elaborate on this more as we go, but it's this idea of three different perspectives: philosophical, political, and economic. All three are relevant. By the way, the same would be true if I was a socialist. I would be saying, listen, it's not just an economic argument I'm making. I'm also making an argument, say, about social justice, or I'm also making an argument about, you know, plutocracy, rule by the wealthy. So that's hard to find, mostly because people specialize. The good thing about specialization is you become a expert in certain fields, but in academia, especially the siloing of disciplines, that people just looking narrowly, myopically in their old field, only economics or only ethics or only politics is a real defect in the analysis, I think. At this point, I think I'll share the screen. So we practiced this earlier. I think this will work. We'll see if this comes in correctly. So let me know, Steve, or yeah, Steve, can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
So this is, I have about 8 or 9 slides. It shouldn't take too long, but I'm going to kind of walk through how the book is put together, what the themes are, some of the more provocative essay titles. And I think you'll see this theme I'm talking about, the idea of the three different approaches, politics, philosophy, and economics. Now, this summary statement really comes from the preface, and I want to emphasize this because I'm going to elaborate on it. And here it says, straight off, my argument succinctly stated: Capitalism is the only legitimate habitat for humanity. Now, those of you who know that phrase, habitat for humanity, know that it's actually a group that builds housing for low-income housing. But I like the idea of the human, that humans need and require a particular context in order to be happy, to flourish, to prosper. So I kind of like this idea of what the habitat is. And really, I'm saying capitalism itself provides a habitat, both a legal, moral, and economic place to flourish. And there are other habitats we know that are very inhumane, very difficult for people to survive and flourish under socialist and other regimes. Now, notice the next set of points. It is sustainable because it's practical. It's practical because it's moral. It's moral, I'm saying, because it's egoistic. That's a very controversial statement. Now, then I say it's egoistic because it's rational. And then finally, it's rational because it's natural. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, all the way back to Aristotle. He said the uniqueness of humans are they have the rational faculty. They have the capacity for reason. They don't automatically use their reason and rationality, but that is what distinguishes them from the beasts. So you can see what I'm doing here is I'm saying, here's a practical social system that is so because all the way down, it basically is consistent with human nature. That's really the argument. And of course, I end by saying, if you don't see capitalism this way, if you don't see all these pieces, this sequencing of the argument, you're not going to be a very good defender of capitalism, even if you want to be. Right. So that's point one. That's kind of it's a lot there, I understand, but that's the most succinctly way I could put it in the book itself. Now, I just want to quickly go through the sections to show you which ones are basically lean more toward moral arguments versus economic versus political. But each section has those three elements to it, which I think it makes it much more powerful. Now, I start with the meaning of capitalism. It's kind of basic. The meaning of capitalism and the morals of it, the underlying ethic of it. The first essay I think is I had to start. And by the way, where do these essays come from? These were previously published over roughly the last decade. Most of them actually in the last 5 years. So they're newer in that regard. But I have specific, and then from 5 or 6 different sources: Forbes magazine, American Institute for Economic Research, Capitalism magazine, my own forecasting firm, essays previously unavailable except to subscribers. And what I did is I went through, it had to be, I think, 300 articles that I had written over the decade, and I culled it down to 65, which I thought were very relevant to this topic. And then within that, organized them, not chronologically, but thematically. And so that's what these sections really reflect. So section 1, meaning and morals, is really analyzing capitalism from the standpoint of what is it? How do we actually define what it is? And does it have any kind of moral or ethical origin to it? And it does. And it's a very, as I argue here, very egoistic ethic. The whole idea of self-interest, the whole idea of trying to gain in life, the whole idea of pursuing happiness and pleasure, even commercially, the profit motive, which is very unique to capitalism, is basically a commercial manifestation of the egoistic ethic. I have some critiques in here. The myth of imperfect capitalism is one of the essays. People look at capitalism and sometimes say it has to reflect perfect competition. There can't be any large businesses with economies of scale. I refute that argument. Notice the last essay in this one, why conservatives won't defend capitalism. So I'm carving out an argument here that isn't just anti-socialist, it's a pro-capitalist argument, and then it looks for possible friends of capitalism, which I would include conservatives and say libertarians, but the way they go at it and in a kind of defensive way is not helpful to advancing capitalism. That's the argument there. Now, section 2, freedom and governance. These essays are much more about politics. They're much more about government. They're much more about the relationship between government, the law, and markets and economics and business and things like that. So you'll notice one of them in here, why progressives loathe judicial review. Judicial review, the idea that we live in the rule of law, that the Supreme Court and other courts should be checking the excesses of democracy and rejecting laws that violate property rights. And so there's a lot of defense in here in this section of the rule of law, property rights, Some of these were written during the time that Obamacare was being passed. And so it was a critique of that, a critique of the claim that healthcare is a right, and therefore that the government can socialize and take over medicine. Notice one of the last ones in that section really has to do with lobbying, has to do with what's called crony capitalism, a phrase I reject. And there I'm making the point, it's called to get money out of politics, get politics out of money making. I'm seeing here that the mixed economy is precisely what causes corruption, that because government is so heavily involved in the economy, so heavily involved in redistributing resources, that in effect it invites lobbying, it invites cronyism. And so the solution would be not to limit the free speech of people but on politics, but rather to restrain government's involvement in the economy. Now, those who know economics more will realize Section 3 is mostly about economics, but notice I phrase it as the primacy of production. Here, I'm trying to stress the idea that economics has gone terribly wrong in the last 50 or 60 years, actually really since Keynes, by focusing so much on demand and not on supply, focusing so much on consumption and the consumer, not on the entrepreneur and the producer. So I start with a defense of Say's law. I mean, Say's law to me is one of the basic premises and underlying foundations of sound economics. It's really the foundation of supply side economics as well, and I'm a supply sider. But that one is Say's law, explaining what it is, why Keynes rejected it, why there's an argument for it, and why it counters Keynesian economics. So this one's much more about economics, but also the preconditions for a prosperous economy and how often government can be at odds with that. All right, let me go to the next, which is Section 4. I had, as Steve mentioned, long career in money and banking starting in 1981 or so. And so I have a love of this field, this subset of economics, if you will. It's clearly economics, but it's on the micro level. But what's interesting, I think, about this section is it discusses not only private banking, the motives, the history of banking in the US, but its interrelationship with central banking. Long ago, going on now 30 years, one of my first books was called Breaking the Banks, Central Banking Problems and Free Banking Solutions. Steve mentioned that. And so I'm very interested in the relationship between central banking and the purpose of central banking and what it does to the private banking system, including things like deposit insurance and other things that might, as FDR called it, put a premium on unsound banking. So I think it's fair to say over the last century or so, US banking, private banking, has been politicized a lot. It's been undermined. The stability of the banking system it's gotten more and more fragile, not because of anything inherent in capitalism or in the profit motive, but the fact that the government finances, government public finance, borrowing, the creation of money is flooding the system in effect and corrupting it. So there's a lot there. Section 5 on the business cycle kind of flows out of the idea that often the manipulation of money and credit by central banks causes the business cycle. Well, if you know, it's very common among critics of capitalism to say, no, capitalism causes the business cycle. It's capitalism that creates volatility and crises and things like that. And it's government that has to come in and smooth the business cycle. I reject those theories. The capitalism itself is not only sustainable, but stable. It's not that there isn't a cycle, but it's not accentuated by markets, it's accentuated by government intervention. The next section you could say is a mixture of economics and politics, the fiscal state and its burden. Here, the emphasis is Section 6 of the book. Here, the emphasis is on budgets, on taxes, on deficits, on national debt, on the Treasury and Fed's role in facilitating profligate finance. So the profligate public finance. So a big, there's some supply side stuff in here as well. So the supply side revolution of the 80s. There's the big critics, as you know, Krugman, the Keynesians and others, even George Bush at the time, remember, called it voodoo economics. So, and anti-Reaganomics, all that kind of stuff. I'm an unabashed fan of supply side economics. I was during the 80s. I was during the 90s. I think it's had a real bad rap. And so that was also in the prior section, but it comes out here in this section as well. So this is a hot topic now. Government deficit spending has become chronic. The last time the budget was in balance for the US was turn of the century. and the deficits are getting wider and is getting bigger, and the Fed is monetizing more and more of it. So that's what's discussed in this section. It's a very ominous trend. Section 7, you can tell, is mostly ethics and morals. Now, I do weave in things like, well, the ethics of the tax code, or the ethics or not of regulation, but all the current concerns about inequality of wealth, inequality of income. What was the discussion this past week? Taxing billionaires with a wealth tax. So this handles the issue of what does justice consist of. I have a classical conception of justice, that people earn what they get in a free society, that there's going to be unequal results precisely because people are unequal in their talents and their aptitudes and their work ethics and the careers they choose, that we shouldn't be envious of these differences. Now, certainly if the inequality is due to cronyism, the answer is to get rid of cronyism. But there's a lot to be said here about inequality and its source. And in many ways, these essays under Section 7 celebrate economic diversity and variety in ways, frankly, that is celebrated in sports. Diversity and variety is celebrated in the arts and science, and the arts and entertainment. We know that. Even people who win lotteries are applauded, for having windfalls, but not for some reason under commercial circumstances where I would say people really do earn their position entrepreneurially and otherwise. Section 8, I don't think I would have written a lot on Section 8 had there not been a revival of protectionism, especially under Trump. So, but there had been, we know, going all the way back to the turn of the century at Seattle, at IMF meetings, anti-globalization, anti-free trade, anti-big business and multinationals. So these essays basically defend free trade, quite radically actually defend unilateral free trade. So that's an argument, quite rare even among free traders, to argue that a country should adopt free trade regardless of what other countries are doing, and that's a benefit straight out. Section 9, crises real and exaggerated. Now, the last 20 years, we've had 3 major crises, but there's been a lot of small ones as well. So 9/11, basically a foreign policy issue and a crisis, and all that followed. 2008 and 9, a financial crisis, and more recently, COVID. Now, in all these cases, I find that the criticism is that something in the private sector did it. Something in the private sector caused it. And the result was more government intervention afterwards. In the case of the financial crisis of 08-09, there was not a restraining of the GSEs. There was not a shutting down of Fannie and Freddie, or all the things that promoted unaffordable housing. The whole policy had been to promote housing ownership among those who could not afford housing. So what did we get after that? We got Dodd-Frank, we got the Volcker rule, we got restrictions on what bank executives pay, on dividend policy. So the tragedy, I think, here, and what I bring out in the essays here, is in each of these 3 cases, the problem was really government intervention, or in the case of 9/11, negligence, just not unwillingness to defend against possible terrorism. And even the more recent case of lockdowns and things, this is not a tragedy of COVID itself. It's a tragedy of the policy response, the very authoritarian policy response to COVID. That is really what has, at least temporarily, really harmed and hamstrung major economies, including the U.S. economy. So there's a theory, it goes all the way back at least to Robert Higgs, who in 1987 wrote a book called Crisis and Leviathan. Now, Leviathan means big government. And Higgs noticed that through the years, whenever there were crises, the net result, during the crises, government would get more involved. And then after the crises, the government intervention would not be ratcheted back down. It would be ratcheted back up. So crises and emergencies and emergency decrees and the kind of things that happen with emergencies, very, very important from the standpoint of whether we preserve our liberty or not. These are used often as excuses for taking away liberty that are never regained afterwards. And the final section, 10, varieties of anti-capitalism. I go through the various, first of all, really the rarity of cases for capitalism, but also in these essays I showed there are many enemies of capitalism, and they can range from socialists to communists to Keynesians to environmentalists, in many cases some feminist literature against capitalism. The stakeholder argument, one of my last essays here, a very sharp critique of the whole stakeholder view of capitalism, which subordinates the rights of shareholders. So it's quite a task if you want to be pro-capitalist, because you're facing basically at least a dozen enemies. Sometimes they just rotate through. So the point of that section is to identify who they are and what their particular gripe is and how to handle it. Now, a couple of exhibits, and then I'll just turn it over to questions. I want to just show you some of the exhibits. There's about 40 of them, which may sound like too much, but I think one of the values of the books is it has pictures and exhibits. So you're not just reading text for what otherwise is a fairly long book, about 500 pages. But I've put in exhibits to illustrate many of my points, and I'm just going to show you 4 or 5 of them. Here's one that comes early on page 34, and I call it the ethical, legal, political elements of capitalism and statism. And this will be another way of summarizing my approach and give you a better idea of my approach. Now, on the left side, I have capitalism, and on the right, statism. And what I'm putting below are basically what I consider to be the pillars of each system. So in terms of argument, and by pillars, I mean, what are the political, economic, philosophic origins or arguments for these systems? Now, statism literally means putting the state above the individual. And there are many forms of it, but I thought I'd pick the broader form called statism. But you can have a state that's very strong under fascism, very strong under, well, even theocracies. The state is very strong under Iran. So there are many versions of statism, and I contend really only one genuine version of capitalism. Now look at capitalism. On the left, I'm saying, let's start from the top. It's really a system of constitutionalism where it doesn't allow government to do just anything it wants. It's very important that it be a restricted government, a kind of American system of government with separation of powers, rule of law, Supreme Court striking down things that are unconstitutional. You don't get that with statism. With statism, it's authoritarian. It's basically the idea of constitutions are not going to limit us. We're going to do what we want as political leaders. It's more of the Venezuelan model. And in Venezuela, one of the first things Chavez did was get rid of the Constitution and then name himself a dictator. Now, capitalism also is rights-based. And by rights, I mean, to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. These are like the basics of the American system, which is why America is most known as a capitalist culture. You don't get that with statism. Statism is the idea that you're duty-bound to serve the state or serve the group, or serve the proletariat, or serve the Aryan race. Duties really abound under statism. And if you declare rights, if you say, wait a minute, I have a right to my life, to my liberty, they'll say, no, you don't, not under statism. You must serve the state. That's why it's statism. Well, it's well known under capitalism that it's known for private ownership and control of the means of production. Well, even socialists would admit that. And on the statist side, their view is it should be public ownership and control of the means of production, usually meaning the state. So that's an obviously clear distinction as well. Now, if you go deeper, now we're getting much more philosophical. If you get to the underlying root of private ownership, what is it? It's individualism, really. It's the idea that I'm an individual, I earned this property, I earned this, like the right to exist. I'm to be individuated and respected as an individual. I'm not to be treated as a cog in a wheel. Not true under statism. The statist view is you're part of a collective. You're not really responsible for the outcomes in your life. It takes a village, and recognize that you're socially constructed. You don't really have free will. And it's a very common view under statism. So that's another big difference. Egoism, going still deeper. The idea that you should pursue your self-interest, that you should not sacrifice yourself either to the state or to others. Now, this doesn't mean you should hurt others. But egoism is a very distinctive morality of capitalism, probably the most controversial part of capitalism, because this is the part where conservatives might check out and say no. Even individualism, some conservatives would say no, it's the family, not the individual, that's at the root of things. So here, when it gets more philosophical, you get people getting very defensive and very reluctant to embrace capitalism. Statism really calls for self-sacrifice. And altruism doesn't mean friendliness or kindliness toward other. It means otherism. Ultra means other. And so statism relies very heavily on the idea that you should be sacrificing yourself for the sake of others, usually for the state, that you should not be pursuing your self-interest. So when you see people really trashing self-interest or egoism or the profit motive, they are attacking one of the moral roots of capitalism. Finally, reason. This gets to the basics of what humans are. They have the rational faculty. They do best when they exercise reason. That runs all through a capitalist system. Some of the most rational, scientific, whether engineers, inventors, business people, entrepreneurs, why do they succeed? Not by going by the seat of their pants, not by emotions, not by whims. They're very calculative. They're very rational. They're very reasonable. And that's also a part of capitalism. And the system sanctifies that. The system basically rewards that, which is nice. Not so with statism, much more based on emotion, much more based on subjectivity. And so I hope that distinguishes for you. The essay, of course, surrounding it elaborates. Just taking a look at the clock here. Okay, I think we're okay, Steve. Good. All right, I have about 10 more minutes. This is a matrix I've used at Duke for a while to help the students distinguish major systems, because this can be very confusing when you start throwing around terms like capitalism or socialism or fascism. It's not as common today to talk about feudalism, but there are people who want to go all medieval on us, like in Iran, and bring back feudalism, which is the pre-capitalist system. But I've created this matrix over the years, and I think it's helpful. Now, notice what I've got here. This is a way to differentiate these systems. And I leverage off of the idea that even a socialist would say, well, I want public ownership of the means of production. And under capitalism, it's private ownership. Well, here I bring that in. That's what one of the sides of the matrix is, ownership, private or public. But notice up top, I also have control, private or public. Now, the idea here is if you own private property, you own the right to control it, right? To, first of all, earn it. You have a right to work laws. But then once you earn property, you should have the right to consume it or save it, right? Or trade it or gift it to your kids. So we have to think about it. It's not just the title to ownership that matters, it's the use. And if you have title but not use, that's not really full ownership. And by the way, this can include not just the means of production, but say ownership of your body, ownership of your personal property. It's a big dispute now, right? Does the state have the right to inject things, mandate that you inject things in your body, like vaccines? So notice this distinction though. If you go with a system that's private ownership and private control, I'm saying that's capitalism. That's in the northwest quadrant here. So capitalism is a system where private all the way. And the opposite in the other diagonal is socialism. That's down in the southeast quadrant of this graph. Public ownership and public control of the means of production. Now, I don't think the US and Europe is actually moving towards socialism. The world moved away from socialism in the 80s and 90s. And in fact, in Britain, they had nationalized most of the industry in Britain until Margaret Thatcher came along. And remember, her program included not just monetary and fiscal reforms, but denationalization, privatization, they called it, of a range of things, from British Telecom to British Coal, British Steel, even the mails, I think, were privatized. So we had become, and then the Soviet Union, of course, the quintessential socialist regime of the last century, fell apart and failed, and all its satellites as well. The real danger is now fascism. Now, I know this sounds very 1930s. It sounds, like Hitler, Mussolini, but that is the system actually that we've been moving toward. And it's a very vicious and nasty system. But notice in my matrix, it's really public control with private ownership. And so this is you keep your property, including your own person, but the government will tell you what to do with it. The government will be very authoritarian, and mandates will become the new phrase, mandates, decrees, executive orders. Notice the presidents that come into the White House now these days They spend their first week writing executive orders all day long, and sometimes reversing the executive orders of the prior executive. So this kind of authoritarian attitude toward governance, toward public governance, is basically the fascistic model. And as I indicated earlier, one of the essays in here goes to the stakeholder argument. The stakeholder thing is totally fascist. The Davos crowd, the ones that end up in Davos, Switzerland, under the World Economic Forum, the head of the World Economic Forum coming out with the book, it's basically an argument for fascism, that big business, it's okay to be big as long as you accede to the woke culture and as long as you agree to be told what to do by government. And there's a kind of partnership that goes on here, which is very insidious. So that's as to a matrix that this matrix occurs in an essay where I elaborate much further. So I encourage you to read that. Now, back to this issue of where have all the capitalists gone, I do want to stress that I use the word two ways. You know, if you ask someone, what is a socialist? They'll say an advocate of socialism, of the system. That's actually accurate, that's true. But if you say, what is a capitalist? They will not say an advocate of capitalism. They'll say a financier or a banker, or someone who provides capital. And so it does have those two meanings. And I play off that in the book. What is very rare today is have capitalists as advocates of capitalism. We have many more, of course, financial capitalists. The rarest thing of all is to combine financial capitalists with ideological capitalists. In other words, there's very few rich people who are pro-capitalist. And that's a head scratcher for most people, because the Marxist view is the richer you are, the more pro-rich you are. And that's not necessarily true. It's a very odd phenomenon that some of the richest people in America are anti-capitalist. George Soros is a perfect example. Bill Gates is another example. There are many examples of rich people, we can talk about this in the Q&A, who are suspicious of capitalism. Now, the reason I have this exhibit is this timeline of neoliberalism. Here's where I want to basically do a hat tip to a half dozen really amazing people writing between 1940 and 1980 and 1990, where I end the timeline, because that's when the Soviet Union disbanded. And these are the pro-capitalists, what's typically called the neoliberals, neoliberal, that new liberalism, the new case for liberty. And starting with people like Carl Snyder, who wrote this fabulous book, really an underappreciated book, Capitalism, the Creator, was mostly an economic argument for how wonderful capitalism is. But to read that in 1940, when capitalism was under enormous attack from the Keynesians and otherwise, that was really quite a book. The more famous one, The Road to Serfdom. I mean, Hayek's book in 1944, basically saying, if you ask for a mixed economy, you're going to get less and less freedom. You're going to get more and more tyranny. It's not, in other words, a stable system. And I think we've seen that in the last 20 years or so. The mixed economy is not a stable system. It either has to go toward more statism, more controls, more authoritarianism, or you have to go the other way. Well, I won't go through all these names, but these are some famous names. Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson, Mises, Human Action, Mises, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality, Hazlitt's Critique of Keynes, The Calculus of Consent by Buchanan and Tullock, Milton Friedman, an obvious champion of capitalism and freedom, The Capitalism and Freedom, the name of his book in 1962. He came back with, what was it, Free to Choose in 1980. Rand's Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, 1966. Harvard philosophy professor Nozick, Robert Nozick, a very important book, 1974, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Not that libertarian view had not been advocated before, but it hadn't been advocated by a Harvard professor. That permitted a lot of other people to be able to build upon that in academia. So to this day, there's way more people in academia willing to be libertarian, willing to be Austrian economists, willing to study objectivism than there used to be. Jude Winniski, The Way the World Works, the beginning of the Reagan Revolution and supply side, but other people not mentioned here, Art Laffer, Robert Mundell. These were the giants of pro-capitalist argument for about 50 years. And it's a very inspiring story. And it really shows what can be done in a very short period of time for good. I say here at the end, notice the political aspects of this. Thatcher is elected in Britain. Reagan is elected in America. Mulroney in Canada. And they all were hated, despised by the socialists, as you know, but succeeded enormously. The one answer to my question, where have all the capitalists gone? I hate to say it, they're all in their graves. I mean, they're all dead. The problem is, or let's say the opportunity, where are the students of these giants? Where are the ones standing on the shoulders of these giants? And what's happened in the last 20 years is basically we have not picked up the torch that has been passed, or the batons, whatever metaphor you want to use. There has been a real reluctance, there's been a real negligence on the part of those who believe in liberty and capitalism to make the argument. This foundation has been laid in all these wonderful books and all these wonderful speakers and intellectuals, and it just has not been picked up with the same verve and argument that's necessary. My theme in the book really is the reluctance is not on the economics of it. The economics of capitalism are undisputed. Capitalism produces the goods. Capitalism produces prosperity. The socialists admit this as much as anyone. So that is not really the issue. If you listen to what they're saying, yes, it produces the goods, but it's unjust. Yes, it produces prosperity, but unequally. Yes, it produces prosperity, but it's ruining the planet. No longer ruining labor, but now we're ruining the planet or future generations. So if you look at this, you see that all the energy, all the moral certitude, all the anger really is coming from the anti-capitalist side. And there's a lot of reticence, there's a lot of shyness, there's a lot of silence on the pro-capitalist side. My contention is that could not possibly happen unless people felt that they were morally disarmed. And the root of it, I think, is a real reluctance to defend rational self-interest. Some economists will do that, but even they're reluctant to do it. I'm going to skip over this because we're running over time, but the essence of this exhibit on 167 is to show how radically, economically and financially, things have changed in the last 20 years. So this comes from a broader essay I published at the American Institute for Economic Research. But if you just look at the top, you'll see 1980 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2020. So I'm just comparing literally two 20-year periods with very, very different policy backgrounds and policy mixes associated. The first being much more pro-capitalist, much more supply side oriented. The second, the last 20 years, being much more Keynesian, much more Marxist. And the results are radically different in terms of the prosperity of the country, the performance of the stock market, and various other things. Finally, I'll leave you with this. It's a very busy exhibit, but it's one I'm really proud of. This is an attempt on one page, and this has been refined over my years of teaching Capitalism For and Against at Duke. It's a seminar for freshmen. We ask 3 questions and we go through the entire semester and say, we're going to look at the friends and foes of capitalism. We're going to study the arguments for and against it, but we're also going to try to classify their arguments along 4 lines, namely, how do they conceive of capitalism? In other words, what is capitalism? So that's the first column. The second one, do they consider it practical? In other words, do they consider that it's able to be efficient and produce the goods? They all have very different answers. Sometimes they share the answers, but that's a distinguishing feature as well. Next question, is it moral? Is the system considered ethical by these people? Well, you can imagine the foes would say, no, it's not moral. The friends would say it is, or they might hedge whether it is. And then finally, is it sustainable? Imagine if you said, well, capitalism produces the goods, but it's immoral, therefore unsustainable. So I put in the sustainability argument because there are all sorts of theories about capitalism that even if it's good, it might not be sustainable. And of course, if a system is not sustainable, that would be one argument against it, that it's literally not sustainable, either on its own grounds or other grounds. So, but if you can check off all of these, as very few people do, and say, what is capitalism? The system of constitutional liberty with private property. Is it practical? Yes, it produces the goods. There's no question it does that. Is it moral? Yes, because it fits human nature. It fits rational self-interest. Is it sustainable? Of course it would be, because it's the practical system made for humans. If you look at this list, the Marxists are critics, the Keynesians are critics, the conservatives are semi-friends, the libertarians and objectivists, they're friends, but they have a different argument for why they're friends of capitalism. The last two, environmentalism, I marked down as very anti-capitalist, as well as feminist. So I know there's a lot here. I'll stop there, but I think that gives you the essence of the book, some of the unique features of the book, and I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I hope you'll acquire the book, give it a read, tell others about it, maybe put a review up on Amazon. That'd be great.
Okay,
Steve?
thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. We do have some really good questions that have come in.
Okay.
7 or 8, looks like at least 7 or 8 good questions. So I'll start off with one from Jeff White. Jeff has been a regular attendee of our events. His question is, quote, protectionism is mutual masochism, end quote. If we lose to other countries like China, the industries that make it possible to defend our country, our own country, cannot protectionism be justified in that sense? And you talked about this a little bit last night.
Yes, that's a good question. In cases where it is feared that industries necessary to national defense might be lost without protectionism, to me, that is a semi-plausible view for protectionism, if there ever was one. Now, someone raised the issue of China. Let me just say before I get into particular countries, yeah, I think it is important for a country, especially through its diplomats in the State Department, in this case, State Department, or the Department of Defense could do this, to classify and designate other countries as either friends or foes. Now, I know it's not always this black and white. There's mixed cases, but the U.S. itself, of course, is a mixed case. If you ask others, is the U.S. a friend or foe of other countries? They'll say, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But this is important because if they're truly an enemy, I think it's perfectly proper for a government to say, you can't trade with the enemy. Iran is a good example today. I think it's unabashedly anti-American and often threatens not only to exterminate the U.S., but its ally like Israel. So in a case like that, the government can say, you cannot send technological equipment to Iran or give financing to Iran because they just turn around and do terrible things. But that's not, to me, really protectionism. That's just a foreign policy decision. Now, short of that, if you do not designate another country that way, you can't really punish businessmen for trading with them. You can't really punish or restrict or ban I don't think properly, other corporations from trading with them. Now, the reason I make the case, now in a case where you can say, listen, we don't have any steel industry, therefore we can't build tanks and bullets to me, that's just an issue of, have you run your own steel industry out by your own policies? If that's true, that's your own fault, not somebody else's. But suppose Japan and South Korea are the major providers of steel. You would want to make sure you have friendly relations with them and not have any trade barriers. If you're really reliant on them for military equipment and material and things like that, it's an argument for remaining friendly with them on trade. Just quickly, I want to say a couple of examples. One of the reasons I'm for unilateral free trade is you can't really find any examples of foreign countries doing things like imposing tariffs on the things we send them, or suppose they turn around and say, we're going to subsidize some of our industries and then ship goods to you. I mean, in these cases, they're really either punishing their own citizens. That's what a tariff is. It isn't really on others. It's taxing their own citizens, or subsidizing. If China subsidizes some industry and sends us goods that are cheaper than they otherwise would be, it amounts to sending us a gift. So to me, it makes no sense to look a gift horse in the mouth and say no. Just take the gift and let the locals in China and elsewhere complain to their government about the burdens they're imposing. Did you notice, by the way, with Trump, when Trump put tariffs, he would say things like, China is paying the tariffs. I mean, that's just not true. Tariffs are paid by Americans who import stuff from China. So the tariffs are just taxes on international goods. So I hope that answers some of your question. And there's a lot to it. There's much more than that, but I write about this a lot in the book.
Yeah, I think it really is on a case-by-case basis to evaluate whether a foreign country is a danger, is a security threat. Okay, moving on to another good question here from Robert Gay. Robert's another regular attendee of our events. He asks, in a previous presentation, Dr. Lawrence White, that's who I just had as my speaker for my last event. He says, Lawrence White discussed the implications of a central bank digital currency in the United States using what is occurring in China. What are your thoughts on the U.S. developing a central bank digital currency, CBDC, for the U.S. dollar to remain competitive in world markets? And also, if I may, how do we combat the misunderstandings of socialism and other schemes out there, given no one wants to listen?
Well, let me take the first one. I am a critic and a skeptic of central banking per se. And so the what I consider the more narrow technical issue of how they manipulate currencies or what kind of currencies or monies they emit or regulate, I'm always suspicious of what they'll be doing. Now, the digital currency, of course, and crypto just generally, is clearly the more modern approach to the monetary system. You know, people are very reluctant today to advocate the gold standard. It sounds like some Dickensian throwback to centuries ago. Why are we still using these clunky old coins? I'm a student, actually, of Larry White, and we met in the mid 80s, and he introduced me to the concept of free banking and the gold standard. I knew a little bit about the gold standard, but not about free banking. So that's what I'm an advocate of, actually. So free banking means no central bank at all. It means private banks issuing their own monies convertible into reliable things, anything that customers find valuable. But it's, to me, a more objective monetary system than we have with central banking. Part of my critique of central banking has been that central banks are not in place to help the economy or smooth the business cycle or even create safe and sound banking. They're in place to help the government finance itself. And when governments behave themselves and don't deficit finance much, the central banks are usually well behaved. But I think we've seen, and they're independent, there's an argument for independent central banks, but I think we've seen that as governments have become more profligate, the central banks have become more promiscuous themselves in terms of monetary issuance. So I'm interpreting the possibility of digital currency issued by central banks as a way to co-opt, take over, substitute for something that they're eyeing the rise of crypto. And they're saying, I'm not sure, we don't like that. China is banning it, of course. I could see the Fed doing that. So I don't see it as them trying to come into the modern world and adopt a digital currency. I see it as them saying, we're not going to allow the private sector to go around us and challenge the dollar. We're going to be a big part of this as well. And we may have to, as we once banned gold ownership, they criminalized it. We may have to do the same thing with crypto. Why would they do it? Because they want to remain their monopoly status. The central banks want to retain their monopoly status with the government. I'd say one last thing, Treasury and other finance ministers are very eager to have digital because it would give them the opportunity to go right into your bank account and take money. I mean, there's none of this paper with 1040 filing tax returns or anything like that. It would enormously help them to just take the tax money they need. And by the way, to deposit subsidies as well. Equally, someone receiving welfare subsidies, they could just debit their, well, in that case, credit their account. So I think the whole digital thing is also an attempt to get rid of the cash society, to get rid of the discretion you might have in your own banking and the secrecy associated with it that will all go away. I know that's a cynical take on the digital revolution, but there it is.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And now we got let's see, I'm going to move to a question here from James Bond. James is actually Deputy Director for our DC chapter, and he just recently retired from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So James, in his own right, is an expert on monetary systems.
Great.
So My James question is based on a quick review of the chapter subtitles in your book. Near the end, you have one titled Good News, Bad News View, Good News, Bad News Views of Capitalism. We could use some good news these days. What are some of the good news about American views regarding capitalism?
American views regarding capitalism. Um, I was almost going to answer whether it's not really the views so much. I'll give you two good things. The technological revolution, I would say, is heartening to me. This may sound funny to free marketers and any free marketers out there. For me to defend Silicon Valley, for me to defend social media, Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter, and all these. To me, it's not so important whether these guys and gals are pro-capitalist or not. I wish they were. They're really not. But they have created these platforms and they have created these technologies which allow us, my gosh, to do what we're doing right now. Zoom and to communication. And if in the beginning they try to shut down platforms and ideas they don't like, notice that other ones are being created. So I think that communication and telecom and all this kind of teleconferencing revolution that's occurring is very good news because it permits people with better ideas to get those ideas out. Now, it also permits people with bad ideas to get their ideas out. But in terms of worrying about free speech, which I do worry about, and cancel culture, which I do worry about, the more options there are, the better. And I think it buys us some time in terms of saying, well, we do have time to save the free society from a kind of total subjugation. All right, if I were to name one, so that's more like the technology. If I were to name one other thing, maybe this is a bit self-serving, but I am at Duke and I am an unabashed pro-capitalist. And I have colleagues who are, and I know there are colleagues in other universities who are. I don't think that was true 25 years ago. It just wasn't. There were certain conferences I go to, academic conferences, where the commonality between the participants might be an appreciation for liberty. There's something called the Public Choice Society, which is really very nice, very professional. They've been around for many years, and they're suspicious of government intervention in the economy. API is another one, Association for Private Enterprise Scholars, I think is the acronym. If you went to their conference 20 years ago, there might have been 60 people. If you go now, there's 400 people. So there's something very interesting. Maybe they're not as famous names as occurred in the list I gave you, but there's a lot of them in academia. Are they still a minority? Yeah, they're still a minority. Are they mostly in the economics department? Yes. So they're not so much in the philosophy or political science departments. But that to me is good news because they're also producing future students who would be for liberty as well. I'm using liberty broadly here now. Any kind of conservative, libertarian, objectivist take on things would be good. And there's way more of them than there used to be. So those are two positive things I would name.
Okay. All right. Got another question here from Carmelo Paviera. Question is, through your matrix on political economic systems, you highlighted that fascism, with the example of the policy suggested, promoted by the World Economic Forum and his chief, where they see a form of woke future with public control and large MNEs. In Europe, the general public does not have or see the risk of these policies promoted by global institutions like the World Economic Forum. Can you tell us how to promote authentic capitalism and fight those woke social and economic ideas and public policy proposals? Well, one thing is the publication of your book. But
well, Steve, that's a very good answer. Yes. Tell the World Economic Forum to invite Salsman on stage. That will never happen, but maybe we can distribute books at the next WEF. What would I say here? I make obvious in the book that the shareholder model of capitalism, it's actually redundant to me. Shareholder capitalism is a redundancy. Capitalism is the system where the people who own the shares run the companies or hire people who run the companies.
Right.
So, I mean, that was really Milton Friedman arguing that in 1970, when he was trying to push back then against the idea of socially responsible corporations. Now, everyone wants to be socially responsible, but he knew, he was very smart and prescient at the time to know that this was really the beginnings of a call for corporations to serve other than shareholders. So I would put it this way, just as you need to defend your own right to your own life, liberty, and property, you should recognize that the same thing is true when you associate in forms of business. When you put money into a business and get shares back, it means you share in the business, you own it. You should be the sole determinant of what that business does. You hire the managers, you have a mission statement, you're producing a product or service. You should really resist the idea that anybody else has any say in that whatsoever. The stakeholder view, of course, is pushing against that. Their view is it's not shareholders, but stakeholders who should have a say, and that includes almost anyone on the planet other than the owners. This is an indirect way of getting a Marxist result. If you know the history of Marx, it was, we must violently take over corporations. We must have militancy. We must have revolution. And when that didn't really occur, because it really didn't, in the 50 years after Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, the socialists of the world said, we need to get this by vote. It's not going to happen by bullets, but maybe it can happen by ballots. And so the whole thing of not revolutionary socialism, but evolutionary socialism gradually over time, or the AOC approach. Well, we're not for socialism of the Stalinist variety, but let's have democratic socialism. Let's vote for it. That still does lead to tyranny. People did vote for Chavez in Venezuela and then his successor, Maduro. So I fear that that's what stakeholder is. It's an attempt to backdoor take over corporations. Notice, not quite nationalizing them. That's why it's fascistic. It's getting people on the boards of directors and telling the companies to do what the government bidding is.
Right.
So,
Okay.
a rousing return defense of shareholder capitalism is really important, really necessary. Take it to these CEOs, go to them, go to shareholder meetings and say, why are you not serving me anymore? I own this place. Another approach you could take is, imagine saying to someone, you think you own your body? Well, I'm going to tell you what to do with it. You think you own it, but I'm going to go tell you to work for me and I don't know, pick cotton in a field somewhere. If that isn't obviously slavery, I don't know what is. Now, that's what the corporations are doing. They're basically turning themselves over to be enslaved by others who want to dictate terms to them. Very bad.
Okay, so I see some of our next questions kind of have a similar theme about, isn't there a role for government? So I got a very good question here from James McFarland. He asks, what role does regulation of the financial markets have, particularly against fraud? He says, I worked in a Western jurisdiction where the financial markets are primarily unregulated and sentences for fraud are very low compared to the US. For example, 3 years in jail for running a $80 million Ponzi scheme.
Yes, so this is a good question because it's often when you hear of a kind of uncompromising advocate of capitalism like me, the first thing to think about is, oh my God, he must be an anarchist. No, anarchy is anti-capitalist. It's actually one of the anti-capitalisms I discuss. So that part of the libertarian movement, which is not for constitutionally limited government, but anarchy, I'm a big critic of. So I would put it this way, capitalism depends on government of a particular size and scope and function. It just should be there to protect individual rights. Against what? Against people who would institute force or fraud. You mentioned fraud. To me, fraud is an example of force. It's just like an indirect way of taking something from somebody. So the government definitely should be in the business of preventing that, or if they can't prevent it, to penalize it. But what it comes down to is something actually not much different from what Robert Nozick and Ayn Rand and others, and John Locke, by the way, going further back, advocated. Government should provide police, courts, and military. That's it. All the other things, the what's called a redistribution state, the welfare state is really improper because it's violating rights. Now, regulation, if you have a system of courts and commercial law and contract law and torts and civil and criminal, I mean, you know, all the corporate law, you know that the courts involve all those things. And to me, those are all ways to protect individual rights, including against financial fraud. I think the proliferation of financial fraud, including people like Madoff and others, is actually not due to a lack of legal remedies. It's due to government intervention in the economy. Even the SEC, which never got on to Madoff, how was Madoff discovered? By competitors who looked at the rate of return and said, that is unnatural. There is no way the Madoff funds are doing that by any kind of honest means. And I forget the guy's name. He was up in Boston. There was some financial guy who uncovered the fraud, went to the SEC, and the SEC didn't do anything. So some of these regulatory agencies, which pose as protectors against fraud, actually give people a false sense of security and basically throw away the idea of caveat emptor, buyer beware. There is no buyer beware anymore because they think the government officials are saving them. So that's a long-winded way of saying, no, we're not for anarchy here, but for government either preventing or punishing, certainly fraud. Fraud, to me, is a form of initiating force against someone.
Okay, we've only got maybe
I think Steve's screen has frozen. I don't know if anyone else notices that, but I have. Ryan, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
Do you notice the same? That
Yeah, it's frozen for me. Let's see if he can
Okay.
leave and join again.
Maybe in the interim, I just talk about something. Do you have access to any of the questions as well, Ryan?
Yes, I do actually.
Oh, great. I think we have I think Steve wanted to go to 2:15. So maybe he'll try to get back on. So that would mean we have about 7 minutes to go. So if you have any other questions there, you want to relay to me. I'm also going to check the chat.
Sure. Yeah. Which one did he actually just read? Do you know who's?
I'm checking. Well, wait, here's one I said. There was one. Can you comment on the epilogue? Yes. Oh, okay. Here's one from Bettina. Can I comment on my epilogue, which is called "Yes, Follow the Science in Every Field"? I'm glad you asked. It's one of my favorite, if I may say so myself, one of my favorite essays. Bettina, this was a case where I was seeing people say in the area of public health and the issue of COVID, they were criticizing people for not following the science. Now, my actual view in this essay is that the COVID thing was not following the science. All the masking and social distancing and shutting down business, I thought the whole COVID, I still think the whole COVID thing was not following the science. But on the other hand, I wanted to defend this idea of following the science, that the pro-capitalist argument should be also pro-science. If we're also pro-reason and pro-rationality and all those things, I want to be a defender of science. So the point of this essay was to say, in every field, we should not only follow science in things like epidemiology and in public health, but follow the science in politics, follow the science in economics, follow the science in morals. And here you see, I think, a widespread violation of science in all these fields. So, for example, in politics, the science of politics tells us that government should be behaving itself, should be protecting rights, not violating them. So it's a very unscientific thing to have a very authoritarian, out of control, capricious government. That's what we have today. So in that regard, they're not following the science on politics. On Steve, I think you're muted. And what we decided to do is just open up the chat and start answering questions. So let me just quickly finish this one. I'll turn it back over to you. So I'm answering Bettina's questions about the essay on follow the science in every field. Bettina, on economics, I also argued in this essay, well, they're massively deficit spending. They're massively redistributing wealth. the Federal Reserve is massively monetizing debt, that whole thing violates the science of economics. So that's really what the point of the essay was, to take up this charge of science and to say, no, we should be for following the science, but on all these levels, in all these different fields, they're actually not doing that. So that was the point of that.
Yeah, sorry about my disappearance. I lost the power. So, but I recall, and I've actually lost the Q&A questions.
I have it in front of me.
Okay, there was one question I thought was really good. Actually, I think two questions were very closely related. And there were questions about the safety net. Should capitalism provide a safety net? I think that's a very good question. It's an ongoing question. It always comes up.
Yes, that's a very good question. My quick answer to that would be capitalism is not against charity. In fact, when we were the most capitalist ever in the 19th century, there were a lot of mutual aid societies. There was a lot of philanthropy. There was a lot of churches obviously offered these. Now, it has to be voluntary in my view, first of all, because you don't want to violate other people's rights. So the idea of coercively taking money from people and then pretending that you're the philanthropist is just, to me, just immoral. So, so the idea of a social safety net was the government basically nationalizing charity. And it started doing that, of course, in the mostly during the New Deal. And it's just improper. And it also leads to greater dependency. And it leads to the idea that you have welfare by right, not by an act of charity and generosity on the part of the givers. When there's voluntary private charity, the givers are very motivated to monitor the success of their programs because it's their money. And it leads to much better results in terms of the recipients not becoming wards of the service, forever. It becomes more like a temporary remedy for someone who is having a temporary setback. So social safety net sounds very nice, and it's really not very nice at all because it creates this dependency and a degeneration really of those who are on the system. The idea of successive generations of people on welfare and leading to things like out of wedlock births and things like that is really detrimental, certainly to certain groups, subgroups of the economy. So if you're pro-capitalist, don't be anti-charity, just be against the coerciveness of the current welfare state. It's a totally improper what the welfare state is.
Yeah, I think another argument against safety nets is if you have a real capitalist system, I think you have more morality. Yeah, I think the people are more moral and therefore more willing to help others through charity.
Yeah, and the self-responsibility. Everyone has had the experience. If you are a taxpayer, everyone has had the experience of saying, "Listen, I pay an exorbitant amount of taxes already," and you don't feel as literally as charitable or as friendly to others who are down and out because presumably they've been taken care of, but they're often not taken care of. And what about the generation of poverty just by public schools and other institutions that make people more likely to have to go on welfare? Unless that's remedied, you're just creating more potential future welfare recipients and then funding it. It's a vicious circle downward. I should also say that capitalism, it's undeniable, sometimes criticized. Capitalism is a very dynamic system. It's changing a lot. And that's part of the fun of life. But there are people who are scared of that. They'll say, I don't like all these changes. And I would prefer to have safety. I prefer to be lying in a net. I mean, literally, the language is they're very apropos. And now the funny thing is, capitalism left untrammeled does lead to greater safety in life. I mean, just and hygiene, disease, all these things are improved due to capitalism. It's the insurance industry. We forget that there is a private insurance industry insuring against risk. So capitalism is one of the safest systems you can get when it's truly free, but it doesn't mean it creates dependency. It's safe because that's a rational thing to do, to live in a safe, clean culture where lifespans are increasing and things like that. But the social safety net system we have under the welfare state does not do that. It does the opposite.
Okay, well, we're now at about 2:15 p.m. So we kind of run our course here, but I wanted to just end with a question that I had for you, Richard. we talked about terms and language, and we talked about using the term, and like last night we were talking about using the term freedom and free enterprise versus the term capitalism. And I always thought that it's actually better to use the term free enterprise, because I thought that it did not have sort of the negative connotations that capitalism
Right.
has. But you actually have an opposite view. You actually have a reverse view. Well, first of all, do you consider capitalism and free enterprise the same thing? And if so, why do you think the term capitalism is better?
Yeah, we should. My view is we should definitely embrace the word capitalism. I would not say it's synonymous with free enterprise for the reason I said earlier. Capitalism, to me, even to its critics, is a broader system than just free enterprise. So free enterprise to me is the stand-in for free market economics. Well, capitalism is that. It does say leave the economy free. But to me, it's much more than that. It's this cultural aspect of it, or even what we were just talking about, the dynamism of capitalism. So there are these various other, like, ethical, cultural, if you will, maybe fuzzier aspects to capitalism, which are definitely part of it and definitely buttress it. And if you just go for free enterprise, you're just asking for free markets, no small thing. But to me, that's not the major objection to capitalism. As I said before, most people do, even the critics, they don't say that markets don't work. And they might even say, Obama used to say this, yeah, we want capitalism and free markets so it produces the goods that we can redistribute. So it's the second part of it is, wait a minute, that's the part where you're violating capitalism, because once people produce the wealth, they should be able to decide what to do with it. The very first chapter of this book, Steve, defends the word capitalism and actually goes through the history of how we even got the word. The word didn't even show up until 1850. So Adam Smith, interestingly, didn't even use the word. But the origin I found of it, and that's really what the essay was about, it was about the etymology of the origin of the word capitalism. It's interesting, capital is pretty obvious. That's the machinery and equipment you use to make stuff. So economists were using the word capital for a long time. And then they would use the word capitalist as the person who mostly owned these things and, lent them out to entrepreneurs. And then capitalism, the ism part, was when someone realized, wait a minute, there's a system we're noticing now in retrospect of the rule of law and the profit motive, which is favorable to this use of capital and this lifestyle that capitalists are living. Okay, but the funny thing is the people who coined the word hated it. So capitalism was first, the word was introduced by socialists. See, I think it's like an indirect compliment. They don't realize how wonderful a system it is. But I also trace it to the roots of, if you think of the word cap, C-A-P, captain, capital of a country, the baseball cap you wear on your head, the Latin root is actually head. It's actually, in effect, brains. And one of the themes running through my book is this is the system of the mind. This is the system that rewards creative people, brainiacs, if you will, inventors, engineers, entrepreneurs, artists, and you could call them the elites. They call them the elites today. But these people aren't parasites. These are not people who are hurting those of lesser talent. They're ones that are really holding up the world. They're really the ones who are propelling human beings on to greater and wonderful things. So that's the main reason why I say that word is fine with me. And capitalism is great, and it should be embraced for that reason, precisely that reason, that it's a system of reason, of humanity, practicing reason.
So you think it's actually a broader term than free enterprise?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Although it incorporates free enterprise, but free marital relations too, free friendship forming. So to me, enterprise is economic activity. If that's all that capitalism is defined as, how are we going to handle all these other things? Like justice and morality and fairness and friendship and love and romance and arts, sciences. Those things are really important. And capitalism has something to say about them, which is also good.
Right. So
that can't be left out, I think.
Okay, well, Richard, I want to thank you for a terrific discussion. And I want to thank everyone who's attended, and hope you all enjoyed this great presentation by Professor Salsman. And hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll end things right now. I'll take care.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye everyone.